Now, the campaign group Don't Divide Us says that it's discovered that more than 20% of local councils in England and Wales encourage the teaching of, wait for it, anti-racism models like critical race theory in schools. The figures were obtained by a Freedom of Information request to local authorities. Now, critical race theory is synonymous with the idea that white people, the accident of birth, the skin colour you're born with, give you structural advantages in society. And I tell you what, I'll take you up to County Durham, former pit villages, and show you the advantages of structural society from being white up there. It legitimises the concept of this white privilege thing. And earlier this year, the former Education Secretary, now Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi, said that young people aren't snowflakes and schools must teach children how to think, not what to think. Well, to analyse these findings, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Professor of Politics at the University of London, Eric Kaufman. Eric, thank you very much for your time. Could you actually just tell my viewers, go back to basics, and actually tell my viewers what critical race theory actually seeks to promote?
So critical race theory essentially says that any disparities between racial groups are essentially a result of what they call structures and unconscious biases that reproduce these disadvantages and hierarchies over time. So they would not pay any attention to other explanations for gaps in racial outcomes, be it in education or income, that might have to do with whether a group derived rich or poor in a country, the values that may hold within a group, whether this be, and we could look at Jews, we can look at ethnic groups and ask, why do some ethnic groups do better than others? That they're not interested in, but they are only interested in gaps between whites and people of color. So yeah, this is really a very unscientific approach, which sort of says that all of these gaps are as a result of these unconscious biases and invisible structures that somehow we can't measure or test in any scientific way, but hey, we just have to believe they're there. And so what they want to do is somehow dismantle these structures based, again, on untested and unscientific approaches, such as changing the meaning of words or introducing certain forms of teaching into classrooms, emphasizing things such as white privilege, unconscious bias. Again, a lot of these things have even been debunked through sort of more rigorous forms of testing, but they persist with these concepts.
Eric, riddle me this. If we consider that the definition of racism here is prejudice, discrimination or antagonism by an individual, community or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group, how is this not racism?
Well, I think it is. It's not treating people equally. So if it's suggesting that whites are distinctively racist and ignoring the fact that other groups are also racist. In fact, a study out of the Henry Jackson Society showed that more hate crime was committed by non-whites than by whites if you consider their share of the population. But this is completely elided into a very binary majority, minority, black and white approach. So yeah, I do think it is unequal treatment by race and can be classified as a form of racism in the sort of traditional definition of racism, which is individual hatred and prejudice towards another individual on the basis of race.
So if a council, if a local authority endorse the teaching of critical race theory, are these schools actually obliged to teach it, or do you find actually there is a real activism within the schools themselves clambering over each other to actually do this?
There's a lot of receptivity, I think, amongst certain teachers, not all teachers, certain teachers who are very receptive to this ideology, which I've termed cultural socialism. It's based on the idea that rectifying any inequalities on the basis of race or gender or sexuality is the most important value. Protecting such groups from harm, including the harm of being offended by speech, is the most important value, and so you move heaven and earth in order to achieve that. So yeah, the other thing I would add is this 23%, people shouldn't imagine that only 23% of schools are getting this. And in fact, I've seen data which I can't yet release. This 23% is simply a share of those who responded to the FOI request, which is a minority of councils. And actually, people should understand that the levels of teaching of critical race theory are much higher than this 23%, and that will become clear in the future. But this is actually very widespread. We've seen pushback against Stonewall in their attempts to introduce some of the sort of pro-trans ideas into organizations. I don't think we've even begun to uncover the scale of this teaching that's going on in British schools. I think people would be shocked if they understood the actual level to which this has penetrated into the schools.
Well, Eric, that's a very depressing conversation that we've just had, but I thank you all the same for your insight and actually shining a light on this issue. That was Professor of Politics at the University of London, Eric Kaufman. Thank you for your time.